All right, I'm Jim with Cyber-Recon, here to take you further on your security career, get you started in security, increase your security knowledge, and get you ready for the Security Plus exam from CompTIA. Today we're talking more about comparing and contrasting types of attacks. We're talking about the cryptographic attacks that you need to know for subdomain 1.2. So with that, let's jump right into the slide deck. And here we are, jumped right in. In this domain 1.2, you're going to cover a lot of information, and part of that information is cryptographic attacks. We're going to attack cryptography, and we're going to attack the way that things are encrypted and protected, both in transit and locally on the drives of your system, servers, and devices. So let's jump right into this slide deck and get going. So cryptographic attacks. So first of all, we have to figure out what cryptography is. So cryptography is the art or science concerning the principles, means, and methods for rendering plain information unintelligible and for restoring encrypted information to an intelligible form. So we're gonna try to hide stuff. We're gonna try to scramble stuff up so that it can't be read, so people can't understand it. If they do pick it up, they steal it off the network or they steal it off of your computer, hopefully it's encrypted and they're not going to know what it is. It's all scrambled up. Attacks that capitalize on the weaknesses of cryptography or the cryptographic implementation are the types of attacks we're going to talk about in this video. First off, we're going to jump right in. We're going to talk about a thing called the birthday attacks. And the birthday attack comes from the birthday paradox. And in this paradox, there's the basic premise they talk about all the time is that in a group of at least 23 people, there's more than a 50% chance that two will have a birthday on the same day. And you go, well, so what's the big deal with that? And really what we're saying is that if you have a group of a certain number of people, there's a chance that you'll have a collision of maybe the same passwords. In this case, we're talking about the same birthday, right? If you move that number up to 70 people in the room, there's a 99.9% chance that two people will have the same birthday. And this is based on, of course, 365 different possibilities. If we get to a number like 366, there's going to be a 100% chance there's a collision, two people with the same birthday. And that's what we're talking about here. When we talk about passwords, if you had 365 different combinations of passwords and you got 23 people in the same room, there's a 50% chance or better that two of them will have the same password, right? And we can move this number around. If we're only using numeric numbers from 0 through 9 or 1 through 0, however we want to look at it, that's 10 numbers. So that number goes way down. So now we're talking in 10, we'll have, by the time we have 10 people in a room, then we're going to have a collision. So as we increase the size of our password, the number of people that would have to be met in the same room, so to speak, would grow exponentially. So as we go from 365 to a greater character space, we start using things like uppercase, lowercase, numeric, and special characters. Altogether, that increases our character space. Number of possibilities goes way up, and then it reduces the possibility of this birthday attack. So really what it is we know that we're going for a chance when two people will have the same password. In this case, we start with the birthday paradox. They have the same birthday. Big thing to know about this one is the magic number that everybody always talks about is this 23. If you have 23 people in the same room, there's more than 50% chance that two will have a birthday on the same day. That's what you're going to hear over and over and over. But the premise is we're talking about getting a collision in different values. Next thing we want to know is there's a thing called plain text ciphertext. This can be used as an attack, right? So if an attacker knows both the ciphertext and the plain text of the same word or the message, they can use that information to reverse engineer the key. So if we see in the bottom, if I know that automobile equals this scrambled line of text that starts with a B there, then I could determine that the key really is just shifting the letters one space to the right. So A becomes B, U becomes V, and so on. So now I know the key. Now I can decrypt anything. So the big thing is we don't want the attacker to have both the ciphertext and the plaintext version of cryptography, especially a password. If they do have the plaintext and the ciphertext of one, then they can figure out the key and figure out all the rest of them. So we don't ever want the attacker to be able to get the plaintext and the ciphertext at the same time. Next one we do is we talk about password attacks. And there's a bunch of password attacks we're going to talk about, and because that's really what the hacker wants to do. The attacker wants to get a password. They want to get credentials to get onto a system. They want to get credentials to elevate their levels of access. So we start with passwords because passwords still are the most common form of authentication. We're obviously moving to multi-factor authentication, and that's why it's important, is because, as you'll see, these passwords become weaker and weaker as computing power becomes more powerful. So password from NIST, we'll start with definitions: a string of characters, which is letters, numbers, and other symbols used to authenticate an identity or verify access authorization. Always good to know the definition, so we're starting with the same foundation. So we know there's some places where there's poor password choices, like we have far too characters. We have maybe a 4-character password we're going to use. Using known words in your password, always bad, and we're going to see why in a second. And then a limited character set, so maybe we're only using numbers or only using lowercase letters. Something like that reduces the size of our character set is something that's going to weaken our passwords. So these and a bunch of other reasons are why people like to attack passwords. First of all, they need to get in the system as a bad guy, as the bad actor, as the, let's say even they're doing it for their job, for your company as a pen tester or a red teamer, they're going to want to attack passwords so they can get on the system. Nefarious folks, those hackers, the evil doers that are coming at your system, they're going to want your passwords too, because that's the most common form of authentication. So one way we can break passwords is we can use a thing called rainbow tables. And this, if you've ever looked up a value in Excel, this is essentially what we're doing. So for every password, there's going to be a cryptographic hash of that password. And if you remember back to pass the hash, that's what we use to break into the system. We use that pass the hash attack to move the hash around and authenticate ourselves just using the hash and the username. So every password is going to be hashed, and those values can be stored in a table. And depending on the type of encryption you're using, there's going to be a predetermined hash for every password. So in the theory of a rainbow table is we list every possible password, and using that encryption logarithm, we list every possible hash next to it. And then we just have to find. So if we get the hash, I can just do essentially a control F and find that hash, and therefore find that password. It's obviously a little more complex than that. We usually use a program to run rainbow tables, but essentially it is passwords, pre-compiled passwords and hashes put into a big file that we can search and find the password. We can add salt to our encryption, which makes it much, much harder to do a rainbow table. When we salt it, we add a random value to the encryption scheme, and then that makes the same password result in different hashes. So it does make it easier to defeat rainbow tables if our encryption is using a thing called salting. One of the problems with rainbow tables is they can get large really fast. So if we have an NTLM, or New Technology Landman password of between 1 and 8 characters with the 4 types we talked about earlier, letters, uppercase and lowercase, numbers, and special characters, our rainbow table for all of those combinations would be about 576 gigabytes big. Then we'd use a program to search that and find the password we're looking for. So rainbow tables are a good way to do, especially an offline attack. If we can get all of the hash values somehow off of the computer, we can use rainbow tables to turn the hash value back into the password, and then bang, as they say in Great Britain, Bob's your uncle. Another thing we can do as an attacker, we can use a thing called a dictionary attack. And in a dictionary attack, we are going after that user who uses a dictionary word for their password. So it's normally a program that uses words in a predefined dictionary as the password, and we try those against the system. And dictionaries can be built for specific traits, and they are. There's generic ones, there's special language ones, there's dictionaries built on sports or cars, different nationalities, or even what we would call leet speak, where we talk like a hacker. These dictionaries are smart. They can even use character substitution. Like we know that a lot of people use 3 for E or the @ sign for an A. Those are just examples. There's a bunch of numbers that can be substituted. The dictionary attack can build that into the way that it tries it. So essentially, it has a listing of different words that we think the user may have used as a password, and then we just try those, either an offline or an online attack against the password. I want to talk about offline and online when we get to brute force. But a dictionary attack is going to be much faster than brute force because we're going to start with known words, and then obviously in the dictionary attack we can actually prepend or append different things to the word. So a lot of times people will put at in the front of their password and an exclamation at the back of their password so that they get their special characters. The dictionary attack can play that in. The dictionary attack program can automatically put an at the beginning or an exclamation at the end, or anything that the attacker wants to build into the way they launch this type of attack. So really, this is why we don't use dictionary words in our passwords, because these dictionary attacks are much, much faster than a brute force, as we see in a little bit here. So in a brute force attack, we are essentially doing an attack where we try every possible character combination in the space of the character. So if we know how long the password is to start with, that's going to help us, because then we can force the brute force attack to that specific number of characters. So if my organization says your password has to be at least 8 characters long, you can guarantee that 95% of the people are going to have a character set 8 characters long. So we can try limiting our brute force to 8 characters. So in the brute force attack, it tries every single possible combination of characters in that 8 character space. So it might start with A, then try AA, and then AAA, and then it'll go to AB, and then AC, and ABC, and every single combination of letters, characters, numbers. As you can see, this could take a long time. The amount of complexity and the length of the passwords we use greatly impacts a brute force attack, just because longer and more complex passwords result in more possibilities for the combinations that could be used. On the other side of the fence, on the attacker's side of the fence, computers are getting much, much faster. And there's computers that are built specifically for conducting brute force attacks that use multiple GPU cards, or graphics processing unit, gaming cards, essentially. So graphics cards built for gaming are great for breaking passwords because they work wonderfully with math. So a single computer in 2015, so 5 years ago as of this recording, was clocked at just a little under 10 billion passwords a second. So it was trying 10 billion, with a B, passwords a second against a system. So that's a lot. So as we increase our computing power, we have to increase our space of our passwords if we're only using passwords. This is really why multi-factor authentication is important, where we use 2 of the 3 types or more of authentication. So we can use something you know, something you are, something you have. Something you know, obviously, is a password. Something you are is biometrics, maybe your fingerprint, maybe a facial scan, and then something you have is going to be a PIN, a token, your cell phone in a lot of cases. This multi-factor authentication, of course, limits these attacks. But if we have a system that only has a password, we can use brute force attacks to eventually figure out what the password is. Given enough time, a brute force password attack will always break the password. It just depends on how much time you have and how big and complex that password we're trying to break is, because it does try every single combination of characters that are available. So the big thing with the brute force attack is, are we doing an online or an offline brute force attack? So an online attack tries to guess the password live on the system. So like if you're logging into a web page or you're logging into someone's computer, you're doing it right there live on the system. You're online. Most systems, almost every system today, should have this control put in place that after a certain number of bad passwords, the system is either halted or locked out. So it's halted for maybe 15 minutes or 5 minutes or some logarithm that changes over time, or it's just totally locked out until an administrator resets the password. And this defeats the brute force attack. So that case where that GPU built specifically computer that was built to break passwords that can do 10 billion in a second, if the computer that we're trying to break into has a control in place that pauses the login process for 15 minutes after every 5 bad passwords, then we go from 10 billion a second to 5 bad passwords every 15 minutes. So it significantly increases the amount of time it's going to take someone to break into the computer and probably make it impossible to break in. An offline attack, on the other hand, is more effective in a brute force attack. This is when I can steal the entire password hash file out of the system and take it to my computer and then run a brute force attack on it. And that's when I can use that system that has the ability to do 10 billion passwords a second, and I can just beat that password file up until I start finding passwords, and then I can use them to attack the system. In this way, we're removing that security control that's going to limit the amount of passwords that can be tried. Obviously, the problem here is the attacker has to get some way to get to that password file. How can they get to the SAM or the PAM? How can they get to the place where the credential file, the hashes, are stored, right? So that's the challenge in this one. Collision happens. We talked a little bit about it in an example for the birthday attack. A collision happens on the birthdays. We have 2 people with the same birthday. In this type of collision, it's a bad logarithm for the encryption. It's going to result in 2 different values equaling the same hash, and this is not visible to the user, and it really shouldn't happen. We shouldn't have, for example, Sam equaling ABCD exclamation ampersand, and then Wally equaling the same thing. Hashes should always be unique, right? So as we have different values, those should be different hashes. When we have different values in plain text that equal to a exact match on a hash, that's called a collision, and that's what you need to know. 2 different plain text values that are hashed and result in the same hash value is a collision, and it shouldn't happen with strong encryption algorithms. Another thing we need to worry about is downgrading. This is when 2 systems try to communicate, and built into that protocol is where they'll operate at the highest encryption that each system can use. So essentially they're going to downgrade to the highest level that they both can do. So in this case, we may have one system that has really, really strong encryption and another system that has weak encryption. And when they go to communicate, they realize that we can't communicate at this high level. We have to communicate at the lower level over here. So they both back off their encryption to the highest level they both can handle, which is going to probably be lower than the most secure system. We see this in Secure Socket Layer, or SSL. It'll back off to the most secure they both can handle. So a lower level of security than we'd want, right? If we can get this to happen as an attacker, maybe we can get a system to come from a higher level of security down to a lower level of security that then we know we can attack. So we're downgrading to the least common denominator between the 2 systems communicating. Replay attack, we talked about replay a few times. It's where the attacker is going to capture sessions or packets on the wire, and they're going to play them back later. Most systems should protect against this, but you may have some homegrown applications built in your organization that don't protect against this. So we always need to think about making sure that we're thinking about replay attacks when we talk about encryption. So if we have a program we're building that's using encryption technology, this cryptography, we need to make sure that it is not vulnerable to a replay attack. We don't want a hacker to capture the packets going across the network and then replay them later and get access to the system or the data. It's always bad stuff. So I think this is the last thing we talk about in this block, and that's weak implementations. And weak implementations, we're using maybe outdated technology, outdated cryptography, older cryptography that we know is defective, and for some reason we're using it. Maybe it's because legacy programs we have in our organization don't support the new stuff. Legacy hardware doesn't support the new stuff. That's when we need to take our organization and drag it forward in time, because we're using weak implementations of cryptography that don't provide the protections that are needed. Sometimes this is worse than actually having no cryptography at all, because now we have this false sense of security. So, for example, if we're using SSL when TLS can be used, we talked about SSL and downgrading a minute ago. There's a ton of reasons you shouldn't be using SSL. Secure socket layers is outdated and you should never see it. The problem is we do see it still. There's just a ton of reasons we shouldn't. TLS is a much more secure method. TLS 1.2 is where we should be at, in my opinion today. Again, on the wireless side, maybe using WEP or wired equivalency privacy. That's outdated as well. The cryptography, the encryption is bad in WEP. Don't use WEP. WPA, WPA2 is built into every Wi-Fi station access point that's out there today. If you're using something that doesn't have WPA or WPA2, you need to upgrade. That's some old stuff. So that is what we need to know about cryptography in domain 1. These are attacks on cryptography. Obviously, we've got a whole domain that's centered on cryptography. We're going to keep talking about cryptography later in the domain, a huge domain conducted just on the types of cryptography that are out there. So hang out for that. That's coming later. But that's what you need to know when we're talking about threats, attacks, and vulnerabilities. That's the attacks on cryptography. You need to be able to differentiate and know. So know what a birthday attack is. Know what a brute force attack is. Know what a dictionary attack is. Rainbow tables. All these things you need to know as you move your security career forward, as you get ready and go sit down and take that Security Plus exam. I know you're going to do it. I know you're going to do well. Keep staying with us. Hit the bell to be notified when new stuff comes out. Like, subscribe. I hope to see you next time. And as always, be safe out there.